Hi there, I'm Alan, and this is a new episode of the Intelligence Podcasts. For the second time on this podcast, I hosted Dr. Aubrey de Grey, the Chief Scientific Officer and the founder of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, or LEV. This time we are going to have a conversation about cryonics. This is the science that aims at freezing or preserving biological organs or complete dead human bodies in the hope of reviving them in the future. As crazy as it might sound, you will discover in this interview the reality behind cryonics research. This was actually a really interesting conversation because it opened my eyes to the fact that beyond what you might consider as science fiction or very long-term objectives in freezing human bodies and reviving them again, cryonics is also about short-term objectives that are closely related to progress in the healthcare and medical research domain. I invite you to watch this interview to understand more what I mean by that. And if you enjoy this topic and other topics I propose on this channel, please take a moment and subscribe. Thank you for watching. One other direction of research as part of what the LEV Foundation does is cryonics, the focus on cryobiology.
Yeah.
So when I mention cryonics to, let's say, my friends, people in general, this feels often like science fiction, like this image of people in strange liquid, like transparent liquid, waiting to be waken up in the future or on another planet. So what is cryonic? Is that an accurate picture?
Well, of course it isn't accurate, no. Cryonics is an area of medical research that has been even more neglected than the work that I mainly work on. And as you say, most people still think it's science fiction. But at the end of the day, this is because of a really deep-seated misunderstanding of what cryonics is for, and that comes around from a misunderstanding of the nature of death. Most people think, you're either alive or you're dead, not somewhere in between. But that's not true. Death is simply a process of change from being functioning to being non-functioning that takes place over time. Now, so the accumulation of damage in the body that I work on is, of course, for people whose hearts are still beating, who are definitely unequivocally alive. But when your heart stops beating, you don't just suddenly disintegrate. It takes a matter of hours or days before you disintegrate. And that's why, kids especially who have, for example, fallen through ice on a frozen lake when they were skating, they've often had their hearts stopped for more than an hour and been revived, and they have no ill effects at all. And that length of time is increasing as we get better at reviving people of that nature. So if you've taken someone who is legally dead, but they only just became legally dead, in other words, their heart only just stopped beating or their brain only just stopped working, and if you do the extreme version of putting them in a frozen lake, in other words, you cool them down really fast, then they don't decay any further at all. So that means that, in principle, one could revive them later on. Now, the question is, why would one revive them? I mean, they were legally dead. There was some reason why their heart stopped beating and so on. But, of course, medicine keeps getting better, right? We keep getting more and more skilled at repairing and addressing things that used to kill people. The whole of medicine has been about that. So it's completely reasonable to suppose that in decades in the future, our medicine will be so much better than it is today that we could warm someone up who was frozen in this way and, repair the things that they legally died of, just in the same way that today we put people sometimes into a medically induced coma so that their body can take more control over their recovery, so that they don't have, cytokine storms and other extreme reactions, anaphylactic shock, whatever, that would otherwise kill them. Now, there is an additional problem, though. This is the problem that we work on, or rather that we fund work on. And that is that when you freeze somebody, there is an additional amount of damage that is done by that freezing process. Now, historically, that damage was absolutely insanely terminal. There's no way in the world that you could warm someone up. Even if you knew how to fix what they died of, you would not be able to fix what happened when you froze them. About 30 years ago, people figured out a way to eliminate the large majority of that damage that's done by the freezing process, at least 90% of it, but not 100%. There's still so much damage that is done that it's still, most people are not very optimistic about being able to warm people up and repair them. So we need a lot more improvement in that. We need a lot more reduction in the amount of damage that's done by the freezing process. And that's what we're working on.
So in a sense, it's a way to delay or to gain some time until we have the necessary technology to revive someone. So right. Let me say, once we have this technology, we will no longer need cryonics. If we can revive someone directly after their legal death, we will no longer need cryonics in that sense.
The main reason for cryonics today is absolutely to help people who we cannot help with today's rejuvenation technology, because my job is not yet done. In other words, we don't have really comprehensive rejuvenation technology. We have not reached longevity escape velocity. There will still be a value in cryonics even after that time, but it will be different. For people who, for example, have been hit by a truck, so they didn't die from aging, or for people who want to go on long space flights, things like that. But yes, the main reason for cryonics will go away, because that main reason is to take people who have died in the way that most people die, which is from aging, right, and to fix them up, and people will not be dying of aging anymore.
Is the science fiction case also might be a reasonable application, like just freezing someone because we are going to Mars or to somewhere very far in the solar system? Is that something that could be also done by the cryonics?
Yeah, that's what I just said. Probably you wouldn't need to do it to go to somewhere as nearby as Mars, but if you wanted to go to other star systems, absolutely. That takes a very long time. And, there are various ways to do that if we have full rejuvenation therapy, but it might be quite boring being awake all that time. So you might prefer to be in this unconscious, frozen state until you get there.
This is fascinating, actually. So there's also, you mentioned previously that cryonics could also be applied to organs, so to organ transfer. So is this part of what you are focusing on at the moment?
Very much it is. Not least because the public view of that kind of thing, of organ banking for purposes of organ transplantation, is very much not viewed as science fiction. And that's rather amusing, because it's almost as hard as actual cryonics, really. Taking a kidney or a liver or a heart and cryopreserving it, the technical problems are identical. It's only very slightly less difficult than freezing an entire person. So yes, the idea is that the technologies that we are funding will initially be used for that purpose. You take a donor's organ when they've just donated it, and you freeze it down and you bank it. And the purpose of this is to address the problem that exists today, which is that if you don't freeze an organ down after you've taken it out of somebody, then you've only got a matter of a few hours before it becomes unusable on account of the decay that happens. And that means you can't get it from one side of the world to another. And you have to wait for someone who has the appropriate immune system, similar to the person who needs the organ. None of that would happen anymore. We would completely solve the organ transplant crisis.
Yeah, and this is really when you think about cryonics in that, under that angle, it's really something extremely important and very promising in case we can attain it in the near future. Let's also break this down a little bit more, how cryonics work, the work you are funding at a lower level. How does that work, and what are the limitations currently?
Right. So cryonics is achieved by taking somebody who has just become legally dead and cooling them as fast as you can down to a very, very low temperature, lower than at least 140 degrees centigrade, Usually it's down to liquid nitrogen, which is minus 196. And the idea is that once you're down below about 130, 140, there is no chemistry anymore. So no more decay happens. Turns out to be actually rather difficult to go from minus 140 down to minus 196. That's when other things go wrong, but you don't really need to do that. And so people have developed ways now what's called intermediate temperature storage, which kind of avoid that. So the main problem is how to get down to minus 140 in the first place. And the first problem is ice crystallization. So when ice crystals form, lots of other bad things happen. Cells get ripped apart. It's not actually a physical problem, it's an osmotic problem, but I won't go into those details. The main thing is that you've got to fix that. And that's what was done 30 years ago. And I said, 90% of the damage was removed. What people were able to do was develop something called vitrification, which is basically a rather elaborate cocktail of cryoprotectants that you can put into the body before you cool it down. Now, these cryoprotectants only slightly reduce the freezing temperature from 0 to, I think it's minus 22 degrees centigrade. But they also make sure that when the body does freeze, it doesn't freeze as a crystalline solid. Ice crystals do not form. Instead, it forms an amorphous solid. So this is why it's called vitrification, because vitrification means forming of a glass rather than of a regular solid. And this, as I say, pretty much eliminates the damage that is done by crystallization. But there's a problem, which is that these cryoprotectants are a little bit toxic. Only a little bit, but that's bad enough because you have to use really, really high concentrations of them. So the idea is, how can we reduce that? And the work that we're funding is all about reducing that by increasing the speed at which you can cool. If you can cool more rapidly, then the toxicity is reduced in two ways. First of all, you have less time for the toxicity to actually happen. And of course, chemistry happens in actual finite time, right? The other thing is that you can use less cryoprotectant because it turns out that crystallization is a speed-dependent process without going into all the details of that. So you end up with a situation in which you can very, very greatly reduce the toxicity of cryopreservation if you can cool really fast. The method for cooling really fast is quite clever. Normally what you do is you cool from the outside in. You put like ice and such like around the organ or around the person. And the thing is, that means that the rate at which you can cool depends on how big the thing is that you're cooling. So at the moment, if you want to freeze a stem cell or even a nematode worm that's 1 millimeter long, you can do that without any cryoprotectant because you can do it so fast because the surface to volume ratio is so high. But if you go even a little bit bigger, like a fruit fly, let alone a mouse or a liver or anything like that, then it doesn't work at all because the cooling is much slower. So you've got masses of crystallization or else really high required concentrations of cryoprotectant. So the solution that we are pursuing, that we are funding the pursuit of, is to pump gas through the bloodstream, through the vasculature. Now, of course, that gas can be cold. And the particular gas that the company we're supporting, Cryonics, is using is helium for various reasons to do with mainly solubility in water. But anyway, so basically, yes, you can cool at least 10 times faster using this method. And that, as I say, that makes a lot of difference.
Let me try to draw a mental image of that. So the image that someone is inside a liquid cylinder won't be accurate in that sense. It would be just like gas going through the veins and nothing around like.
Well, this is what you're asking about after the process is complete. Remember, the part that I care about, the part that's problematic and we need improvements in, is getting to that point. But yes, after the process is done, then yes, the person will be, or the vasculature will be full of, will be not full of liquid anymore, not full of blood, but full of gas. And they'll be sitting in liquid nitrogen or whatever in some situation where they can stay there without any chemistry happening until we're ready to wake them up. And that's the same for an organ.
Okay, so once we succeed in this, do we know how to revive this today? So this is an easy part or also a challenging part?
it's a challenging part. So for organs, it sounds like it shouldn't be challenging. You just warm them up, and if they work, they work, and if they don't work, they don't work, and you can probably test how good they are before you try to transplant them into a recipient. So you can live with a really high failure rate, right? Whereas for actual people, you can't live with a high failure rate. So there's a lot of work to do to make sure that this really works properly. There's actually another rather technical difference. I'm not sure how much detail I should go into on this one, but it turns out to be harder to avoid crystallization when you're warming up again than it was when you were cooling down in the first place. Now, for cryonics, you might argue that doesn't matter because we won't be doing the warming up until the distant future, and we may have figured out how to solve that problem. But for organ donation, organ banking, as I mentioned, obviously it's a problem we have to address right now.
So there are a few companies that we heard about in the media, public media, let's say, that does that freezing, and some of them are like maybe freeze only the head. If the technology today is not perfect, what do those companies do? Will they be able to revive their patients?
Okay, there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, let me talk about head versus whole body. So I actually am signed up with Alcor only to have my head frozen. I might change that. I keep it under review. But there are a couple of reasons why that's a sensible thing to do right now. One of them is that freezing your head is a lot cheaper, and this is a non-trivial thing. You have to have life insurance to pay for this, right? The second thing is that at the moment, because we haven't really perfected cryopreservation, turns out that the technical details allow a head to be frozen with higher quality, with less ice crystallization and so on, than a whole body. So that's the other reason. But as I say, that's changing over time, so I may change that. Now, you might ask, what's the point of freezing only one's head? Because people would actually quite like to have a body. But the idea here is that by the time we have figured out enough about this and got good enough at medicine to be that we would want to revive anybody, building a new body for them will be the easy part. It's a bit like the kind of big version of tissue engineering, of growing a new liver in the lab, which we're already pretty close to being able to do. So that's the logic of it. Then we've also got to take into account, part of your question arises from the fact that there are people who are cryopreserved now who did not get vitrification because they were cryopreserved before vitrification was invented, or because for whatever reason it wasn't possible to give them the ideal preservation. Now, that means that there are definitely, I would say, most people who are currently cryopreserved, and there's maybe a few hundred of those now. Most of those people, we know that there is exactly no chance, zero chance, of being able to revive them by warming them up, right? There's whatever technology comes along in the future. So the question is, why bother to keep cryopreserving them? And the answer is because a lot of people, and I'm not one of these people, but a lot of people feel that it's quite good enough to cryopreserve people, and then at some point in the future, when our information technology, our artificial intelligence on is good enough, to slice up their brain into really, really thin slices and scan those slices so as to figure out basically who they were, all of their thought, to be able to extract from the structure of their brain what they knew, what they thought, what they liked, what their personality was. This sounds like science fiction, and at the moment it certainly is science fiction. But really, it's the same kind of problem as what was done a couple of years ago with proteins. For decades, people were trying to figure out a way to predict the three-dimensional structure of a protein from its amino acid sequence. And the progress that was being made was almost zero, right? And then suddenly DeepMind came along and they invented this program AlphaFold, which was using very sophisticated machine learning techniques. And it's more or less solved the problem, in kind of, almost no time. So it is, if we take into account, precedents like that, examples like that, then it becomes much more difficult to simply dismiss the possibility that we could scan the structure of someone's brain at really high resolution with all the strengths of the synapses and everything and figure out who the person was.
Yeah, so this question about the brain was following, like, even for people who we think we will be able to revive, what's about the brain? Does the state of the brain is lost? This is, I think, is a big question.
So, everyone has known for a long time that this is a big question. And so, several years ago now, a couple of people did exactly that experiment. Now, at the moment, as I mentioned, we can already freeze and warm up very small animals like nematode worms without using any cryoprotectant. And sure enough, the worms, wake up and walk away. Okay, I mean, not all of them, but most of them do. Right, and this is used routinely in laboratory experiments with worms. Right. So what somebody did was they said, well, okay, let's try and teach our worms something, and then let's freeze them and warm them up and see whether they still know that thing. Right. Now, of course, worms are not very smart, so there's only so much you can teach them. But there are some things, there's been work done on learning and memory in worms. So it was possible to do this experiment, and it came out 100%. Absolutely, they remembered what they had been taught. So, that obviously there's very strongly a need to extend that work to larger animals that are smarter than worms. But for the moment, things are looking awfully good.
So when do you expect, in the same way you have your expectation for LEV, when do you expect we will be able to preserve organs and then to preserve humans?
So honestly, the progress that needs to be made for those things is very substantial. It's very difficult for me to put a number on that. I would say, however, that there's two separate problems, of course, as you just described. The problem of organ preservation for organ transplant is a problem where we want to be able to warm the organ up and have it work quite soon, whereas for cryonics, we kind of don't care how long it's going to take before we do it. Whereas at the same time, with organ preservation, we can accept a rather high failure rate, whereas with cryonics, we can't. So these are two very different problems. I would say that for cryonics, the answer is easy, namely, we should definitely just be carrying on, doing our very best to improve the quality of cryopreservation, but then hoping for the best, and just doing what we can to save as many lives as we can, even though we don't know how soon or how effectively we will be able to revive people. For organ preservation, looking at the state of the research right now, I'm fairly hopeful that we could be able to reversibly cryopreserve human organs within 5 years from now. So again, it's probabilistic. I would say 50-50 chance. But yeah, I think that's the kind of time frame that I would be willing to say 50-50.
This is still like an optimistic, and I hope this will be the case. Like you start to see some positive results in that direction. But what would be funny as a final reflection, like if we, let's say, attain LEV the way you expected, would that deny the need for cryopreservation for a human, entire human, if we can escape death in that way, or like aging?
So you asked that question already, actually. You said, what's the point of cryonics if we have rejuvenation that works? And as I said, we're still going to need it for sudden death, like being hit by a truck. And we also might need it for extra, for traveling to other solar systems or whatever. But yes, the main reason for cryonics right now will indeed be removed.
Exactly. So do you think that if we one day arrive at those techniques solution, they will also be democratized in the same way you expected for aging drugs, or this will still be, let's say, a luxury, or only for maybe most rich people?
It's a very good question. The arguments that I always mention in relation to rejuvenation are extremely ironclad. There is absolutely no question that for all manner of reasons, whether it's not humanitarian necessarily, but just electoral or economic, that we will absolutely see these technologies made available to absolutely everybody who is old enough to need them almost as soon as they are available to anybody. However, for cryonics and cryopreservation, it's a lot harder as of now to make such a solid argument. So I'm not really going to try. I think we just, we need to think about that, but I'm not the right person to answer that question right now.
Anyway, that is really fascinating thoughts and fascinating directions to reflect upon. Dr. de Grey, thank you very much for the amazing discussion, for the fascinating insights, and thank you again for your time.
My pleasure.